At the CEO's glittering gala, he raised his glass and smirked. "If anyone here can play Chopin on that piano, I'll marry them to my daughter." The crowd laughed, until the janitor, with rough hands and quiet eyes, stepped forward. When his fingers touched the keys, the room fell silent. The gala was unlike anything the city had seen that year. Velvet curtains draped from ceiling to floor, golden chandeliers glittered like frozen fire, and violins whispered softly in the background as the wealthiest men and women paraded in their silk gowns and tailored suits. It was the CEO's night, the annual event where he reminded the world that his empire wasn't just about business, it was about dominance. Every corner of the ballroom hummed with whispers of admiration, envy, and ambition. At the center of it all, the CEO himself stood like a king surveying his court. Tall, immaculately dressed, his presence commanded silence whenever he raised a hand. His smile wasn't warm, it was sharp, mocking, as though every word he spoke was a challenge. The room lived on his approval and everyone knew it. He thrived on the power of humiliation, making others dance to his arrogance. Tonight he wanted more than applause. He wanted entertainment that would prove no one could outshine him. He lifted his glass of champagne and tapped it lightly, letting the crystal sing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slicing through the air, "we gather tonight to celebrate success, resilience, and a little fun." His smirk deepened. He gestured toward the black grand piano gleaming under the lights in the corner. "That beauty over there has sat untouched for too long. So let us add some excitement." The crowd leaned in, curious, their jeweled necklaces catching the light. He continued, savoring the attention. "If anyone among you can play Chopin's Nocturne without flaw, perfectly, passionately, I shall grant them anything they desire." He paused, eyes narrowing with arrogance before adding, "Even my daughter's hand in marriage." Laughter erupted across the ballroom. The idea was absurd, a joke that only added to the night's indulgence. Chopin wasn't a composer one simply tried. His music demanded discipline, pain, and heart. None of these rich guests, who cared more for wine than wisdom, had such qualities. To them, the piano was decoration, not destiny. The CEO looked satisfied with the mockery he had sparked. To him, it was a safe gamble. He knew nobody there could even attempt Chopin, let alone master it. But then, something unexpected shifted in the air. From the side of the hall, where the staff usually melted into invisibility, a man stepped forward. His uniform was simple, navy blue with faint stains of long hours spent cleaning marble floors. His shoes were worn, his hands calloused, his shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying loads others never noticed. It was the janitor, the very man who swept up their laughter after the parties ended. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Whispers broke out like sparks. "Is he serious? A janitor? This must be a joke." The CEO raised an eyebrow, his expression dripping with disdain. "You?" he scoffed, looking the man up and down as though his very presence was an insult. "Do you even know who Chopin was?" "Don't embarrass yourself." But the janitor said nothing. His eyes held no fear, no hesitation. Quietly, he walked toward the piano, his footsteps echoing against the marble. He pulled out the bench, sat down, and rested his fingers over the ivory keys. The hall trembled in expectation. The CEO folded his arms, certain this would end in humiliation. The guests leaned forward, eager for comedy, eager to see a man out of place crash into failure. But when the janitor pressed the first note, everything changed. It was soft, delicate, but so full of soul that the laughter died instantly. One note flowed into another, weaving a melody that seemed to pour straight from his heart. His rough hands, scarred from years of labor, moved with a grace that defied their appearance. The room grew still. Champagne glasses were forgotten, conversations dissolved, and all eyes fixed on the janitor, who was no longer a janitor, but an artist, a storyteller with every chord. Each rise and fall of the melody carried weight, sorrow, longing, beauty that pierced through the arrogance of the night. The chandeliers above shimmered as though even they leaned in to listen. People who had come to flaunt wealth now stood humbled, their hearts caught in a spell they hadn't expected. By the time the final note lingered in the air, silence wrapped the room. No applause erupted, no laughter returned. The music had left something too profound to disturb with clapping. The janitor stood slowly, bowed his head with quiet dignity, and began to walk back toward the shadows. The CEO's face had hardened, his smirk gone. For the first time, he had been silenced, not by power, not by wealth, but by a man he had dismissed as nothing. The janitor didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for recognition. He had already won. The room was still thick with silence long after the last note of Chopin faded into the air. No one dared to move. The grand ballroom, which only minutes ago had been alive with chatter and laughter, now stood frozen, every guest caught in a strange spell they couldn't shake. The janitor had not just played music. He had stripped away the masks people wore, exposing their raw, vulnerable humanity. The CEO remained at the center of the room, his hand still gripping the stem of his glass. His jaw tightened as his gaze followed the janitor retreating into the shadows. He hadn't expected this. The dare had been meant as mockery, a theatrical way of reminding everyone of their place beneath him. Yet the very person he had tried to humiliate had turned his own arrogance into silence. And worse, his guests had seen it. Murmurs began to ripple across the room. Soft, hesitant at first, like a current beneath still water. Did you hear the way he played? It was breathtaking. I've never heard Chopin sound like that, not even from professionals. The CEO's daughter, who had been sitting quietly near the edge of the stage, lifted her eyes. For most of her life, she had seen her father command respect through fear and wealth. She had watched suitors parade before her, all chasing her hand for the empire it represented, never for her. But in the music of that janitor, she had heard something none of them had given her, genuine heart. It wasn't for her, and yet somehow it touched her more deeply than anything anyone had ever said. Her chest tightened, and for a fleeting moment she wished her father's words hadn't been a jest. What if they had been real? What if a man like that, so unpolished, so authentic, was the one person who could look at her not as a prize but as a woman? She clasped her hands in her lap, torn between admiration and the knowledge of her father's pride. The guests, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided the CEO's eyes, afraid of how he might react to the praise rising for the janitor. Others leaned into the whispers, emboldened by the truth they couldn't deny. Arrogance had been humbled before their very eyes, and they had felt the weight of it. One older gentleman, a business rival who had always resented the CEO's smug superiority, cleared his throat. "Remarkable," he said, just loud enough for others to hear. "Truly remarkable. Perhaps the most honest performance I've ever witnessed." His words struck the room like a bell, giving others permission to agree. Applause didn't come, but nods and murmurs spread, and suddenly the air was thick with admiration, not for the CEO, but for the man he had tried to belittle. The CEO's face darkened. He slammed his glass onto a nearby table, the sharp crack making some flinch. "Enough," he barked, his voice heavy with command. It was nothing more than a trick. Do not be fooled by theatrics. But the room did not fully bend back to his will. His attempt to dismiss what they had witnessed felt hollow. Everyone had heard the difference between empty entertainment and the truth of music, and no amount of authority could erase it. The janitor, who had nearly slipped out of sight, paused. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes locking with the CEO's. For the first time he spoke, not loudly, not proudly, but with a quiet firmness that carried across the hall. "Sometimes, sir," he said, his voice steady, "the floor you walk on has more soul than the throne you sit on." Gasps erupted. Some guests covered their mouths, shocked at his boldness. The CEO's daughter's eyes widened, her heart pounding at the courage in those words. The CEO, however, stiffened, his face red with anger, yet beneath it all was a flicker of something he couldn't disguise: shame. The janitor didn't wait for a reply. He walked steadily toward the exit, his posture unbroken, his dignity intact. Each step he took echoed louder than the CEO's commands ever had, and the guests one by one moved slightly aside, parting like water to let him pass. As the doors closed behind him, the gala felt different. The chandeliers still glowed, the wine still sparkled in crystal glasses, but the air no longer belonged to the CEO. It belonged to the memory of a melody that would not fade. His daughter sat quietly, her hands trembling. She had seen something tonight that changed her forever, and as her father raged silently beside her, she whispered to herself a thought she dared not say aloud. That was the kind of man worth following. The guests returned to their conversations, but now with a new undercurrent, a sense that power wasn't only measured in wealth, but in truth, courage, and the music of a humble janitor who had silenced an empire. The night did not end the way the CEO had imagined. For hours afterward, the ballroom buzzed with talk of the janitor who had dared to rise, dared to play, dared to speak. Even as the orchestra resumed, even as servers moved with silver trays of wine and desserts, there was no returning to the same arrogance that had filled the room before. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it. The CEO's fury burned hotter with every passing minute. He had always prided himself on control of his business, his employees, and the image he projected to the world. But tonight that control had slipped, shattered by a man he considered beneath him. He paced near the stage, barking orders to staff, trying to reassert his dominance. Yet no matter what he did, the respect in the room no longer belonged to him. His daughter remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the door where the janitor had disappeared. Her mind was torn, her heart restless. For years, she had lived under her father's shadow, treated as a bargaining piece in his games of power. Suitors lined up, polished and wealthy, speaking words as empty as their promises. None of them had touched her soul the way the janitor's music had in just a few minutes. She couldn't stop hearing those notes, couldn't stop feeling the truth that had poured from his rough hands. Finally, she stood. Her father noticed immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. She met his gaze without flinching. "To find the only man in this room who spoke the truth tonight." The ballroom fell into shocked silence. Guests froze, staring, waiting for the storm that would surely follow. The CEO's face twisted with rage. "You dare defy me?" For a janitor. His voice rose, but his daughter didn't falter. "Better a janitor with a soul," she replied softly but firmly, "than a king without one." Gasps rippled across the hall. For once, the CEO had no quick retort, no clever insult. His power came from intimidation, but his daughter's words pierced through his armor. His empire suddenly felt fragile in the face of such simple truth. He clenched his fists, but the more he tried to speak, the more the weight of the night silenced him. She didn't wait for his approval. Gathering her gown, she walked out of the ballroom, each step echoing like a declaration of freedom. The guests parted just as they had for the janitor earlier, their eyes wide with awe. Some admired her bravery, others whispered in disbelief. But all knew they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the chandeliers dimmed. Outside, the air was cool, crisp against her flushed cheeks. She hurried down the marble steps, her heart racing, scanning the shadows for the man who had played so fearlessly. At first she thought he had already gone, vanished into the night. But then, near the edge of the gardens, she saw him, walking slowly, his shoulders heavy with the humility of someone who never expected recognition. "Wait," she called, her voice breaking the stillness. He turned, surprised to see her. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried a question he didn't voice. She approached him, her silk gown brushing against the gravel, so out of place beside his simple uniform, and yet she felt no shame, no hesitation. "Why didn't you stay?" she asked quietly. "They should have applauded you. They should have seen you." The janitor shook his head. "I didn't play for them. I played because music is the only truth I have. Their applause means nothing. What matters is that the music was heard." His humility struck her harder than the music itself. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness but from recognition. Here was a man unshackled by greed or arrogance, a man who carried dignity in his silence. She realized in that moment that her father's wealth, his empire, all the glittering chandeliers, they were nothing compared to the richness of a soul like his. She took a step closer. "Then let me hear it again, not as your audience, but as someone who wants to understand you." For the first time, the janitor's lips curved into the faintest smile. He nodded, though his eyes still held disbelief that a woman of her world would stand before him with such sincerity. But in that moment, the divide between them seemed to fade. Back in the ballroom, whispers grew louder. The guests debated what they had seen, some emboldened by the truth, others clinging desperately to the CEO's crumbling authority. But no matter their opinions, one fact remained undeniable. Power had been challenged, arrogance had been silenced, and a janitor's music had reshaped the night. The CEO, standing alone near the stage, felt the weight of loss heavier than he ever had in his boardrooms. For the first time in his life, he realized there were battles money couldn't win, and truths that couldn't be buried under wealth. In the gardens, Under the quiet night sky, the janitor and the CEO's daughter stood side by side. Their worlds were different, but the music that had bound them was stronger than any wall her father had built. And as the first stars appeared, she knew with certainty this was the beginning of a story her father could never silence. And as the night carried the last echo of Chopin's notes, one truth became undeniable: respect is not earned by power, but by soul.